He brought in disgraced and disenfranchised parliamentarian academics. He'd brought in wealthy royalist courtiers, and he'd persuaded them to work together on the most basic problems of modern science, the things we would still identify as the basic problems. How the hell did he do this? All the main players, when you look closely at them, apart from Wren and Boyle, were linked to Masonic lodges. There was a network of Masonic lodges. The lodge that initiated Elias Ashmore was not a new one. There were lodges under the Stuarts. You can trace them, and you can find them referred. You cross-reference the entries in Ashmore's diary, and you find the names of members of the society. So you can build this up by looking at all the diaries, sticking them into a relational database, and sorting and sifting the data. Find out who was where, when, what was happening. Moray had brought together people who were involved in Freemasonry. He brought together ideas from Freemasonry, and he used them to solve the problems that were linked to the King's Navy. So let's look at the 4 principles that he took from Freemasonry, effectively stole and used to create the Royal Society. Well, the first one is that the study of the works of nature can lead to an understanding of the underlying plan of the great architect. This means that there is an assumption that there is an underlying order to the laws of nature, and it can be determined by observation and experiment. And that is one hell of an insight. That led directly to the work of Newton. The second idea he took was that all men are equal, and if they come together to discuss learning and forbid the discussion of religion and politics, they're going to be able to cooperate. He was right about that. We still forbid the discussion of religion and politics so that we can work together better. This concentration that it brought about on experimental science to the exclusion of all other distractions helped the Royal Society become a major force in creating the modern scientific age. But the third idea he took was the idea that officers and presidents, to have true power, must be elected, and they must have the support of the members that they rule. Now, that had been brought in the 1590s by William Shaw, the first Grand Warden of Freemasonry in Scotland, under James VI, who became the first of England, who was initiated into the Lodge of Scone and Perth in 1601. And Moray built this idea into his society so that the fellows elected their own leaders, so that they would be loyal to them. He brought in one other idea, the idea that wealthy Masons should assist their poor and distressed brethren and give them work. Now you see the purpose behind the mix that he brought together. He brought in wealthy royalist courtiers who were on the up, and we got lots of money coming in, and he brought in poor and distressed brethren who'd been cast down but had skills which were very, very useful for the king. And effectively, he got the wealthy courtiers to fund the scientists. They'd all been strong supporters of Parliament, and they were now suffering great distress. And he persuaded them to sit down with wealthy royalists who in turn helped fund their work and assisted their rehabilitation into Restoration Society. And they were restored. Say Wilkins, for example, ended up as Bishop of Chester. They all ended up being rehabilitated back into the church and the universities. Moray had used his Freemasonry to support Charles II. Moray had a very limited political end when he set up the Royal Society. He'd used Freemasonry to locate people with money and people with mathematical skills, and he'd managed to bring them together. He'd forbidden the discussion of religion and politics to make sure that they concentrated on the things they had in common. He'd encouraged the wealthy ones to support the downtrodden ones. And he'd encouraged the study of the hidden mysteries of nature and science. He saw it as a way of solving the major technical difficulties for the British Navy. The solution he came up was the Royal Society. And it occurred very, very quickly from that first meeting. Now, you read the history books and they say, oh, it was Wilkins who was the driving force. Wilkins had no power. Wilkins had been kicked out of his job. There was only one person with access to the king. There was only one person with access to the royal assent, which was needed to create the Royal Society, and that was Moray. He then pulled back and let them run themselves. He wanted to rehabilitate Wilkins. If he could rehabilitate Wilkins, Oliver Cromwell's brother-in-law, he could rehabilitate anybody. He was really the test case. Now that model lasted until 1830, and then it was changed by another Freemason whose name you may recognise, the Duke of Sussex, first Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England. Here we have the two faces of the Duke of Sussex. He was the first Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England when the ancients and moderns came together, and at the same time he was President of the Royal Society. But he actually got to be Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England against the wishes of the ancients. They were forced into it by the Seditious Societies Act, and he actually got to be President of the Royal Society against the wishes of the scientists who tried to vote him down but couldn't muster enough votes under Herschel. So he actually ran two of the key Masonic organisations at the same time. The organisations which had access to very embarrassing historical material. Look what Sussex did to the Royal Society. He went in with a key agenda. He wanted to reform its collection of books, and he either destroyed or sold off all the non-scientific books and manuscripts, and only kept scientific books, and then bought more scientific books. Obviously just what the scientists wanted. The interesting question is what books disappeared. Now from the early records of the Royal Society you can find out what had been lodged with them and what wasn't there on Sussex's catalogue. There are two key books. Sir Robert Moray wrote a history of Freemasonry. It's well attested that he did it. It was lodged with the Royal Society and it disappeared when the library was reformed. We don't know what he said. And the other person who wrote one was Elias Ashmole. And he wrote a history of Freemasonry which was lodged with the Royal Society, and that also disappeared. Why was the Masonic link with the Royal Society forgotten? You need to ask the Duke of Sussex that, and the reason is that he suppressed all knowledge of the early history and its contributions to society. And his reason was that it was too closely linked with the Stuarts. You look at the date of the formation of the Grand Lodge of London, it's 1718, 3 years after the 1715 Stuart uprising. Look at the other date, the key dates, and you'll find the link to Jacobite rising. There was a link between Freemasonry and Jacobitism. The first Grand Master Mason of Scotland, who was, it's quite a long story how he came to be put in the role. There was no hereditary role, but he assumed that hereditary role and then resigned the role he never had. William Sinclair of Roslin, he was a member of the Jacobite Edinburgh Company of Archers at the time. So there was a strong link between the Scottish Freemasonry, the Stuart Freemasonry, and Jacobitism. And of course the danger was, if you stood up in London in 1717 and said, I am a Freemason, effectively you were saying, I'm a Jacobite. Will you please hang, draw and quarter me at your earliest convenience? Naturally they didn't want to do that, so the Monty Python theory of Freemasonry was brought into play. It said, these gentlemen who are gentlemen Freemasons must have been wandering around the building sites of London, tapping up the local builders and saying, hey lads, you got any esoteric secrets you can share with us? Believe that, you believe anything. So, the Masonic link was forgotten because it was too closely linked with Jacobites. And look how rocky the Hanoverians were at the time of the formation of the United Grand Lodge of England. Look at what was happening in France, look at what was happening in America. They were worried. Why did the Royal Society succeed? Well, the problems of navigation are also the problems of life, the universe and everything. And if you free scientists from the shackles of politics and religious dogma, then they can set about addressing those questions. And that's what Moray did by forbidding the discussion of politics and religion. And you can trace back the advance of modern science and technology directly back to these 12 men, the ones I listed for you earlier, and they were inspired by this man. I haven't got a picture of him. That's his mark. That's his signature incorporating his mark. And he is the moving force. We say Masonry makes good men better. What Masonry did with Robert Moray was took a fairly disreputable mercenary, he was basically a French tart, who could be sold to anybody and used for any sort of purpose undermining the English. And following a couple of traumatic experiences, he was initiated into the Lodge of Edinburgh, he started to attend more regularly, and his wife died. And he then got into a very detailed conversation in writing with Bruce in the Kincardine papers about the meaning of life, the meaning of Masonry, and he started to ask the sort of questions we ask ourselves. And he turned into a person who could actually use the ideas of Freemasonry, bring them in to help the country, and he founded the Royal Society. So he turned from being a freebooter to being a Freemason. What I would suggest, brethren, is that we admit, applaud, and publicly celebrate the life of the first Freemason made on English soil. He's the most successful Freemasonic conspirator of all time, because we wouldn't be standing here watching this display if he hadn't founded the Royal Society. We wouldn't have discovered all the facts of physics that have led us to the various skills which we now use to make ourselves civilized. I think the threat of a Jacobite revival toppling the Queen has receded enough that we can now acknowledge where we really came from. If you want to know a bit more about it, I've got the complete story with all the Harvard references, all the detail of how I put it together in databases and sorted it, how I pieced the story together. There's a revised edition coming out at the end of May. Can't show you one because it doesn't exist yet, but that's what the cover looks like. And if you want to find out a bit more, that's my university website. And yes, there will be new stuff going up at the end of the summer, because I've been teaching for a while, so I've not had time to put anything up for about 3 or 4 months. And there's my website, which has got all sorts of other stuff in there. But there's lots of science stuff in there, because I also taught to institutes of physics and astronomical societies as well. Brethren, that's the story of Robert Moray, a bad man made good by his knowledge of the craft. Thank you.